The west coast of the United States sits on top of a scar that almost nobody knows exists. On one winter night in 1700, the ground off Oregon dropped 3 to 6 feet into the ocean in a matter of minutes, killed entire forests where they stood, and threw a wall of water across the Pacific that smashed into Japan 10 hours later. No one in America wrote it down. No one here even knew it had happened for nearly 300 years. Did you know there's a piece of Southern California that has crawled 280 miles north and is still moving under people's houses right now? Or that mammoths once swam out to the islands off Los Angeles, got trapped, and shrank into a species found nowhere else on Earth? There's a lot more to this coast than surf, redwoods, and traffic. Today we're counting down 20 facts, and the closer we get to number 1, the more unsettling this gets. Let's get into it. Fact 20. The land that isn't from here. Everyone assumes the California coastline has always been the California coastline. Point Reyes proves otherwise. That peninsula north of San Francisco is a slab of rock that originated hundreds of miles south near the Tehachapi area of Southern California, and it has traveled roughly 280 miles north over the last 30 million years. The granite underneath it is between 80 and 100 million years old, and it doesn't match the mainland it's currently pressed against. A chunk of Southern California is now sitting north of San Francisco, and it hasn't stopped moving. Fact 19. The city that's crawling toward another city. Here's the part almost nobody in California thinks about. Los Angeles sits on the Pacific plate, San Francisco sits on the North American plate, and those two plates are grinding past each other at roughly 2 inches a year, which happens to be about the same rate your fingernails grow. Slow as that sounds, it adds up, and Los Angeles City Hall now stands more than 15 feet closer to San Francisco than it did when the building went up. Given enough geologic time, those two cities end up neighbors. The whole state is quietly rearranging itself while everyone argues about traffic. Fact 18. The fault that isn't where you think it is. Ask anyone about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and they'll tell you the San Andreas runs straight through the city. It doesn't. The fault actually runs offshore and cuts through communities like Daly City, Bodega Bay, and Point Reyes Station, while San Francisco itself sits off to the side of it. Plenty of towns along the west coast sit directly on top of the fault line without any of the fame. The most famous fault in America isn't where the most famous earthquake made everyone think it was. Fact 17. The day the ground tore sideways. When that fault finally slipped in 1906, it didn't just shake, it moved. Near Point Reyes, the ground ripped horizontally by as much as 24.5 feet, tearing fences in half and leaving roads that no longer lined up with themselves. Farmers walked out the next morning to find their property boundaries physically relocated. That single moment released centuries of accumulated pressure in seconds. One side of a fence ended up 24 feet from the other side, and it never went back. Fact 16. The island that disappeared. Off the coast of Southern California sit the Channel Islands, and during the last ice age, they weren't islands at all. With sea level roughly 350 feet lower than today, the 4 northern islands were joined into a single landmass that researchers now call Santa Rosa. As the glaciers melted and the ocean climbed, that land was swallowed, leaving only the highest ground poking above water as the separate islands we see today. Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, San Miguel, and Anacapa are the surviving peaks of a drowned country. Fact 15. The mammoths that swam. Here's a mental image that sounds impossible. Colombian mammoths, animals standing 14 feet tall and weighing around 20,000 pounds, crossed open water to reach that island. Geologists believe they made the journey during glacial periods when sea levels dropped and the gap narrowed, possibly around 150,000 years ago, and again during the most recent ice age. These enormous animals swam out into the Pacific and hauled themselves onto a coastline that no longer exists. Nothing about that scenario sounds real, and all of it happened. Fact 14. The giants that shrank. What happened next is one of evolution's strangest tricks. When the ice melted and the sea rose, those mammoths were trapped on a shrinking island with far less food. And over thousands of generations, they got smaller. 14 feet became roughly 5 to 6 feet. The result was an entirely new species, the pygmy mammoth, Mammothus exilis, weighing about a tenth of what its ancestors did and existing nowhere else on the planet. The islands off Los Angeles produced their own miniature elephants, and almost nobody who visits them knows it. Fact 13. The Lost Menagerie. Those islands held stranger residents than just small mammoths. The fossil record from the Channel Islands includes an extinct flightless goose, a vampire bat, an extinct owl, and 2 species of giant mouse, animals that evolved in isolation and then vanished. A vampire bat once flew over Southern California. The pygmy mammoths themselves disappeared roughly 10,000 years ago, along with much of the rest of that lost ecosystem. An entire private world of evolution rose and fell out there, within sight of the mainland. Fact 12. The bones that broke the timeline. In the middle of all that sits a discovery that shook archaeology. Human remains found at Arlington Springs on Santa Rosa Island date to roughly 13,000 years ago, making them the oldest human skeletal remains ever found in North America. Their location matters as much as their age, because reaching that island required crossing open water by boat. That points toward people traveling down the Pacific coast rather than walking overland through the interior. And it lands right at the heart of the debate over how humans actually arrived in the Americas. The oldest known American was found on a California island, and he got there by sea. Fact 11. The landscape that looks clawed open. Fly over eastern Washington and the ground stops making sense. Roughly 30,000 square kilometers of it has been stripped bare. The soil scoured completely away to expose raw basalt, cut through with enormous dry channels, cliffs, and canyons that carry no rivers at all. Geologists call it the channeled scabland. It looks less like erosion and more like something enormous dragged its fingers across the state. For years, nobody could explain what does that to a landscape. Fact 10. The lake that emptied in 2 days. Here's the answer, and it's difficult to believe. Far upstream in Montana sat glacial Lake Missoula, holding something on the order of 550 cubic miles of water. When the dam holding it back failed, modeling indicates the entire lake drained in roughly 55 hours, less than 3 days. Every drop of it came tearing west across Idaho and Washington. That is not a flood in any ordinary sense of the word. It's an inland sea being emptied through a hole. Fact 9. The dam made of ice. What held all that water back wasn't rock or earth. A lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet pushed south and plugged the Clark Fork Valley with ice estimated at 1 kilometer thick, and the lake simply pooled behind it. Eventually, the water floated and shattered that ice dam. The lake emptied, and then the glacier advanced again and rebuilt it. The whole cycle repeated over and over, meaning the Pacific Northwest was scoured not once, but many times. A wall of ice, 2/3 of a mile thick, failed repeatedly, and each failure rewrote the map. Fact 8. To grasp the scale, look at what happened when that flood reached the Columbia River Gorge. Modeling of the surge puts the water rising roughly 950 feet above normal river level at the Dalles, high enough to spill over the walls of the gorge itself and push floodwater miles up every side valley. Downstream, the inundation reached deep into the Willamette Valley, as far south as the Eugene area, dumping mud and gravel across the whole basin. Portland's valley floor is built partly out of sediment delivered by a catastrophe. Fact 7. The boulders that came by boat. Scattered across the northwest are enormous rocks sitting in places they have no geological business being, some of them matching bedrock hundreds of miles away. They rafted there. Chunks of the ice dam broke loose and floated on the floodwater with boulders frozen inside them. And when the ice melted, the rocks dropped wherever they happened to be. Farmers have been plowing around them ever since. Stones the size of vehicles were delivered across state lines by floating ice. Fact 6. The man nobody believed. In the 1920s, a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz looked at the scablands and said plainly that a catastrophic flood had done it. The scientific establishment of the time rejected the idea, because geology then held that landscapes only ever change slowly and gradually, and a sudden cataclysm sounded closer to mythology than science. Bretz was disputed for decades. Evidence kept accumulating through the 1950s until the consensus finally turned and he was proven right. He was correct the entire time, and he had to wait most of his life for anyone to admit it. Fact 5. The forest that died standing up. Along the coast of Washington and Oregon, there are places where dead trees still stand rooted in tidal mud, bare and gray. Stumps of Sitka spruce and cedar exposed at low tide. Geologists call them ghost forests. These trees weren't cut, and they didn't rot in place. They were killed suddenly, when salt water drowned their roots, all of them at once. The evidence shows entire coastal forests died simultaneously, across separate estuaries in a single event. Something dropped that coastline into the sea, and it happened fast. Fact 4. The wave with no earthquake. Now travel across the Pacific. In January of 1700, a tsunami struck the coast of Japan, flooding fields, wrecking homes, and destroying boats. Samurai, merchants, and village officials all wrote it down, and every account shares one strange detail. There had been no earthquake. Tsunamis are supposed to announce themselves with shaking first, and this one arrived with no warning at all. So Japanese records called it an orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent. For nearly 3 centuries, nobody could name what had fathered it. Fact 3. The stories that held the answer. The truth had been preserved the whole time, just not in writing. Indigenous nations along the Pacific Northwest coast carried oral histories describing a night when the ground shook so violently that people could not stand, and the movement made them sick, followed by the sea rising and swallowing villages whole. At Pachena Bay on Vancouver Island, the account is stark: an entire winter village destroyed while people slept, with no survivors among the low-lying settlements. Scientists eventually cross-referenced those traditions with tree rings, sand layers, and Japanese scrolls. Knowledge that had been dismissed for generations turned out to be an accurate record of the disaster. Fact 2. The night the coast dropped. Piece it together and the picture is terrifying. On the evening of January 26, 1700, the Cascadia subduction zone ruptured off the Pacific Northwest in a mega-thrust earthquake estimated at around magnitude 9. In a matter of minutes, the coastline itself dropped, subsiding by roughly 3 to 6 feet, which is precisely what drowned those forests in salt water and killed them where they stood. The tsunami it generated crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and reached Japan about 9 to 10 hours later. One event, one night, and its fingerprints are still on the coast, in the trees, and in Japanese records. Fact 1. The fault that hasn't finished. And here's the secret the West Coast is really keeping, because this story isn't in the past tense. The Cascadia subduction zone stretches roughly 600 miles from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington to British Columbia, where the Juan de Fuca plate is being forced beneath the North American plate, and it is capable of producing magnitude 9 earthquakes, among the largest this planet can generate. It has not produced a major subduction rupture since that night in 1700. Millions of people now live, work, and sleep directly above it, in cities that didn't exist the last time it moved. The most dangerous thing on the West Coast isn't a volcano or the San Andreas, It's a quiet fault offshore that most Americans have never even heard the name of. So the next time somebody tells you the West Coast is all beaches, redwoods, and freeways, you'll know what's actually underneath. The land is migrating north, the islands once held dwarf mammoths, and the oldest American ever found. An inland sea emptied itself across 3 states in 2 days. And a fault nobody talks about dropped an entire coastline into the ocean and then went silent. All of it hiding in plain sight. And now, you're one of the few people who actually knows it's there. If this changed the way you see the place you live, stick around, because every corner of this country is hiding something, and we're just getting started.